Hello, dear listener. Pull up a comfortable chair, pour yourself a cup of tea, and allow me to welcome you back to the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. The war is over, the roses are in bloom, and somewhere among the thatched cottages an old secret is about to be murdered. Again. You are about to listen to Miss Marple and the ancient killer secret. 10 cozy chapters await. Shall we begin? Chapter 1. The Body in the Crypt. The little church of St. Mary Mead had stood upon its gentle rise since the days of the Normans, and on this particular September morning in 1951 it looked exactly as it had looked to generations of villagers. Gray stone softened by lichen, a squat tower topped with a weathercock that had pointed perpetually east, northeast for the last 200 years, and a churchyard where the yew trees leaned together like old gossips. The Michaelmas daisies were coming into their own along the paths, purple and gold against the green, and the air carried the faint, sweet scent of late roses and wood smoke from someone's bonfire. Inside the chancel, Miss Jane Marple arranged flowers with the unhurried precision of a lifetime. She was a small, fragile-looking lady with snow-white hair drawn into a neat bun, china blue eyes that missed nothing, and the sort of pink and white complexion that suggested she had never hurried in her life. She wore a dove-gray wool dress, a cameo brooch, and the expression of mild benevolence that deceived almost everybody. Her fingers, delicate as a girl's, placed each stem exactly where it ought to go, and she hummed, very softly, the hymn, "The Church's One Foundation." Outside, the Reverend Leonard Clement was engaged in gentle altercation with the churchwardens. The subject, as it had been for the past 3 months, was the state of the crypt. Water had been seeping in for years, the floor was treacherous with slime, and the vicar had developed a terror that one day the bishop would descend the steps and break a leg. The churchwardens, whose combined age was 153, felt that crypts were meant to be damp, and that bishops were meant to mind where they put their feet. At last, however, a compromise had been reached. The iron-bound door at the base of the spiral stair was to be opened, the worst of the puddles swept out, and a proper survey made. It was therefore with a sense of modest triumph that the vicar watched Mr. Harmon the verger produce a key the size of a small poker and apply it to a lock that had not turned since Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. The door groaned open on protesting hinges. A breath of cold, tomb-scented air rolled up the steps, carrying with it the smell of earth and candle wax and something metallic that made the vicar wrinkle his nose. Mr. Harmon, who had served in the trenches in 1916 and was afraid of very little, took the electric torch the vicar offered and descended. His boots clattered on the stone. There was a pause, a sudden intake of breath, and then Mr. Harmon's voice floated up, oddly muffled. "Vicar, you'd better come down. There's a gentleman here, and he don't look at all well." The Reverend Leonard Clement was not a man built for athletic descent of spiral stairs, but anxiety lent him wings. Behind him came Mrs. Clement, Griselda, tall, untidy, and incurably curious, and a little more slowly Miss Marple, who laid aside her Michaelmas daisies with care and followed the commotion as quietly as a cat. The crypt was larger than most people remembered. A low vaulted chamber with massive pillars, and along one wall a row of stone tombs belonging to the long extinct family of de Mead. Dust lay thick upon everything, disturbed now by footprints. The beam of the torch jittered across the floor and came to rest upon a sight that brought even Griselda up short. A man lay on his back among scattered stones and broken flower pots, arms crossed neatly upon his breast as though for burial. He wore faultless evening dress, white tie, tailcoat, waistcoat, and glossy shoes that reflected the torchlight like black mirrors. A crimson carnation, long withered, drooped from his buttonhole. His face was thin and aristocratic, the skin waxy, the eyes closed. A dark stain spread across the starched shirt front, and from it protruded the silver hilt of a narrow, old-fashioned dagger. Pinned to the lapel of the tailcoat was a small white card. Upon it, in letters of brightest scarlet, were printed 5 capital letters. K-I-L-L-E-R, Miss Marple, arriving last, stood for a moment on the bottom step surveying the scene with the calm of one who has seen worse things in cottage bedrooms. Then she stepped forward, skirts brushing the dust, and bent to study the card without touching it. "Dear me," she said softly. "How very unpleasant for everybody." Griselda found her voice first. "Leonard, he's dead, isn't he?" "Extremely," said her husband, who had gone a shade of green usually reserved for broad beans. "Harmon, don't touch anything. We must telephone the police at once." Mr. Harmon needed no urging. He was already halfway up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time with surprising agility for a man of 63. Miss Marple remained where she was. She did not approach the body more closely. There would be time for that later. But her gaze traveled gently over every detail. The position of the arms, the angle of the dagger, the precise placement of the card, the faint scuff marks in the dust that suggested the body had been dragged rather than carried. She noticed, too, that the carnation, though withered, had not dropped a single petal. It had been placed there after death and not long since. Above them in the church, the commotion began. Mrs. Price Ridley appeared at the door of the crypt, demanding to know why nobody had come to practice the hymns, saw the gathering on the stairs, and uttered a small shriek that brought half the village running. Within minutes, the churchyard was crowded with interested parties. Miss Hartnell in her eternal tweeds, Miss Weatherby clutching her spaniel, the butcher's boy on his bicycle, and young Dr. Haydock, who had been passing on his rounds and now pushed his way through with authority. Haydock descended the steps, felt for a pulse out of habit rather than hope, and straightened again. "Dead at least 48 hours, I should say. Single stab wound straight to the heart. Very neat. Whoever did it knew exactly where to put the blade." Inspector Craddock arrived sooner than anyone expected, driving himself in a black Wolseley that scattered gravel across the churchyard like hail. He was a tall, dark young man with a deceptively languid air and the sort of mind that Miss Marple had learned to respect. He greeted her with a faint smile that held both resignation and affection. "I might have known you'd be here before me, Miss Marple." "I was arranging the flowers, Inspector. One does not expect to be interrupted by corpses." Craddock's men set up lamps, electric light being still a novelty in St. Mary Mead Church, and the crypt was transformed into a scene of quiet efficiency. Photographs were taken, measurements made, fingerprints sought, though on such dusty stone there was small hope of finding any. The dagger, when carefully withdrawn, proved to be a slender Italian stiletto of the 17th century, its blade no wider than a knitting needle. The dead man's pockets yielded little: a silk handkerchief monogrammed LK, a few shillings in silver, a half-empty packet of Turkish cigarettes, and a silver cigarette case engraved with the crest of a regiment long amalgamated out of existence. No wallet, no papers, no clue to identity beyond the provocative card upon his breast. By the time the body was carried out on a stretcher, covered decently with a Union Jack borrowed from the British Legion Hall, the entire village knew that a stranger in evening dress had been found murdered in the crypt with the word "killer" pinned to his coat. Miss Marple walked home slowly along the lane, her mind turning over the picture she had seen as a needlewoman turns over a piece of embroidery to study the pattern on the wrong side. She noticed that the Michaelmas daisies in the church had been left unfinished. Someone would have to complete them before Sunday. She noticed, too, that Mrs. Dane Calthrop had paused at the lich gate to speak to old Mr. Pye from the antique shop, and that Mr. Pye looked distinctly unwell. At her own gate she met Cherry, her daily help, agog with excitement. "Oh, Miss Marple, have you heard? There's been a murder. In the crypt. Mrs. Archer says the man was stabbed with a dagger and had 'killer' written on him in blood." Not in blood, Cherry, Miss Marple corrected gently. In red ink, I think. And kindly do not leave the fish too long in the pan, it dries so. She went indoors, removed her hat, and sat down in her favorite chair by the window. From here she could see the whole village street, the post office, the Blue Boar, Gossington Hall in the distance, and just beyond the rooftops, the church tower where the weathercock still pointed faithfully east, northeast. Killer, she murmured to herself, reaching for her knitting. Now that is interesting, because in St. Mary Mead, you know, there are 5 people who answer to that name, or very nearly. She began to count them on her needles softly, as another woman might count blessings or sins. Colonel Lucius Killer of the Hall, retired Indian Army, irascible, proud of an ancient name that had caused him embarrassment since Sandhurst. Mrs. Daphne Killer Whitnash, his second wife, 30 years younger and still pretty in a blousy way. Young Roderick Killer, the colonel's nephew who wrote plays nobody produced and lived mostly in London. Miss Philippa Kendall, the organist who had once, long ago, been engaged to a man called Lawrence Killer, dead these 30 years in Egypt. And old Mr. Pye of the antique shop, who dealt in curiosities and was said to have a genuine Florentine stiletto among his stock, though whether he still had it was another matter. 5 killers, thought Miss Marple, clicking her needles rhythmically. And now a 6th has appeared, dressed for dinner and very dead indeed. Outside, the September sun sank behind the yew trees and the church bell began to toll. Not the joyful peal of Sunday morning, but the slow, measured note that told the village a soul had passed. Somewhere a dog barked once and was silent. The shadows lengthened across the neat flower beds and the trimmed lawns, and St. Mary Mead prepared itself with delicious anticipation for a really first-class murder. Miss Marple knitted on, calm and terrible in her gentleness, and waited for the pattern to reveal itself. Chapter 2. Tea and Suspects. By 4 o'clock, the village was humming like a hive that has discovered a wasp inside it. The body had been removed to the mortuary at Much Benham, the crypt door locked and sealed with red wax and official string, and every soul in St. Mary Mead who could find the slightest excuse had drifted towards the vicarage in the hope of learning something new. Griselda Clement, who adored chaos provided it happened to other people, had decided that only a proper tea would calm everybody's nerves, and had therefore telephoned Miss Marple with a plea that bordered on the desperate. Miss Marple arrived carrying a plate of her famous feather-light scones and the air of someone who has already arranged the universe to her satisfaction. She found the drawing-room crowded. Inspector Craddock stood by the mantelpiece looking resigned. Dr. Haydock was helping himself liberally to sandwiches. Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Hartnell sat bolt upright on the sofa, quivering with indignation that a murder should have been committed practically under their noses. And Colonel Bantry had been dragged away from his chrysanthemums on the promise of news. Griselda fluttered about with cups. "Jane, dear, you will pour, won't you? I'm quite overcome. Leonard is no use at all in a crisis. He's gone to earth in his study with the Church Times." Miss Marple took her place behind the silver teapot with the composure of a duchess. The lapsang souchong released its smoky fragrance, and for a moment the room settled into the comfortable ritual of an English tea. Scones were handed, seed cake sliced, conversation reduced to the polite murmur that precedes revelation. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. "The dead man has still not been identified. No one missing from the village, no one expected. The clothes are from Scott and Son in Bond Street, 10 years old at least. The dagger is definitely antique, Italian, 17th century. And the card, he produced it in a cellophane envelope. Ordinary stationery card, red ink from a mapping pen, letters printed with a ruler. Posted nowhere, carried in by hand." Mrs. Price Ridley gave a small shriek. Carried in by the murderer. How perfectly terrifying. Miss Marple handed her a cup with 2 lumps exactly. Sugar, dear. Shock is so lowering. Craddock continued. The interesting thing is the name, or rather the word, killer. There are 5 people in this parish who bear that name, or have borne it, or have been closely connected with someone who did. A delighted rustle ran round the room. Nothing could have pleased St. Mary Mead more than the discovery that the murder touched its own inhabitants. Miss Marple, having supplied everyone with tea, folded her hands in her lap and began to count, softly but quite audibly. First, Colonel Lucius Killer of the Hall, retired Indian Army. His family has owned Gossington Hall since the Restoration, and the name has been a burden to every schoolboy who bore it. Lucius was mercilessly ragged at Sandhurst, I believe, and has detested jokes upon the subject ever since. Colonel Bantry gave a reminiscent chuckle. Remember when young Lucius came home on leave in 14 and the band of the depot played for He's a Jolly Good Fellow and then struck up Who Killed Cock Robin? Poor fellow nearly court-martialed the bandmaster. Miss Marple inclined her head. Second, Mrs. Daphne Killer Whitnash, the present mistress of the Hall. She was on the stage before her marriage. Musical comedy, I understand, and is still very pretty in a rather obvious way. The colonel married her 5 years ago after his first wife died. Village opinion was divided as to whether it was a love match or merely a middle-aged gentleman's fancy. Miss Hartnell sniffed. 28 years difference. I call it indecent. Third, Miss Marple continued serenely, Mr. Roderick Killer, the colonel's nephew and heir presumptive. He lives in Chelsea, writes plays that no one produces, and visits the Hall only when he is short of money, which is often. A charming young man, but sadly lacking in application. Dr. Haydock grinned. I treated him for a broken ankle last year. Fell off the stage during a rehearsal of his own tragedy. Said it was the first time any audience had shown real feeling. Fourth, said Miss Marple, Miss Philippa Kendall, our excellent organist. 25 years ago she was engaged to a young archaeologist named Lawrence Killer. He died of fever on a dig near Luxor. Philippa came home, took the post at the church, and has lived quietly ever since. A most superior person. And fifth? Asked Craddock, watching her closely. Fifth is old Mr. Archibald Pye of the antique shop in the High Street. His real name is Killer Pye. He added the hyphen when he retired here 20 years ago, but everyone knows he was born plain Killer. His nephew was in the same regiment as the colonel during the war. Mr. Pye collects weapons, among other things. I have seen a very beautiful Florentine stiletto in his window, though I noticed last week that it was no longer there. A profound silence greeted this catalogue. The fire crackled. Somewhere a clock ticked. Outside, the September afternoon faded into soft gray. Inspector Craddock set down his cup. 5 people with the name Killer or something very like it, all within half a mile of a murdered man labeled Killer. That cannot be coincidence. No, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. It is not coincidence. It is design. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward, eyes bright with excitement. But which of them could possibly? My dear, Miss Marple interrupted gently. It is much too early for that. When one is knitting a complicated pattern, one does not decide after the first row which stitch is going to be dropped. One simply observes how the wool behaves. Griselda, who had been listening with her mouth slightly open, suddenly remembered her duties as hostess. More tea, Inspector? And do try Jane's scones. They are quite perfection. Craddock accepted another scone and turned to practicalities. I shall need to interview all 5 naturally. The colonel first, I think. He is the head of the family. Miss Marple gave the smallest of smiles. Lucius will be furious. He considers the police an impertinence at the best of times. But he will receive you, after he has telephoned his solicitor. She rose, smoothing her gray wool skirt. And now, if you will forgive me, I must go home and see to Cherry's fish. One murder a day is quite sufficient for a woman of my age. At the door she paused, looking back at the crowded room with mild, bird-like eyes. 5 killers, she repeated softly, and a dead man who may perhaps make 6. How very curious it all is. Then she was gone, leaving behind her the faint scent of lavender and the unmistakable feeling that the pattern had already begun to form beneath her delicate fingers. Chapter 3. The Return of Roderick. The next morning broke soft and golden, the sort of September day that makes one forgive England all its winters. Mist lingered in the hollows, rooks cawed from the elms around Gossington Hall, and the village, having talked itself hoarse the previous evening, prepared to talk itself hoarse again. At 20 minutes past 10, a dove-gray Bentley convertible, long, low, and outrageously theatrical, swept into the high street with a muted roar that brought every net curtain twitching. It drew up outside the Blue Boar with the effortless arrogance of a duchess's barouche, and from it unfolded a tall young man in a charcoal suit, a crimson tie, and an expression of amused detachment. Roderick Killer had arrived. He paused on the pavement to light a Turkish cigarette with a Dunhill lighter the size of a small grenade, and surveyed the village as though it were a stage set awaiting his entrance. Mrs. Archer from the post office, pretending to sweep her step, received a charming smile and a murmured "Good morning, dear lady," which left her pink and flustered for the rest of the day. Roderick sauntered into the inn, ordered a pink gin with the air of a man who had invented the drink, and allowed the entire lounge bar to understand without seeming to boast that he had driven down from town at a moment's notice because his uncle had telephoned in a frightful state about a corpse in the family crypt. "Ghastly taste, don't you think?" he said to the assembled company, which now included the butcher, the baker, and 3 members of the Women's Institute who had suddenly remembered urgent shopping. "Leaving a chap labeled like a parcel. Uncle Lucius is threatening to shoot the next person who makes a joke about the family name." Someone tittered nervously. Roderick raised one eyebrow, and the titter died. By 11 o'clock he was at the hall, kissing his Aunt Daphne with exaggerated devotion and wringing his uncle's hand as though they were the oldest of friends instead of the coolest of enemies. Colonel Lucius, red-faced and apoplectic, had spent the morning roaring at Inspector Craddock and was in no mood for relations, however decorative. Daphne Killer Whitnash received her nephew in the morning room, a confection of chintz and faded photographs. She was wearing peach-colored chiffon at 11:30, which Miss Marple later described as very actressy, and greeted Roderick with a pretty cry of delight. "Darling boy, how perfectly marvelous to see you. Lucius is being simply impossible. He won't let me go near the church, says it's vulgar to be interested in murders. As though one could help it." Roderick dropped into a chair, stretched his long legs, and accepted a cigarette from the box on the table. "Tell me everything, Aunt Daphne. The telephone is so unsatisfactory. Uncle rang me at the club, bellowed something about a body wearing his old mess kit, and then rang off. I've been devoured by curiosity all the way down." Daphne lowered her voice dramatically. "It was too dreadful. The man was in evening dress, white tie, carnation, everything, and stabbed through the heart with the sweetest little dagger. And pinned to him was a card saying 'Killer' in red letters. The police think it's a lunatic, but Lucius swears it's a plot to ruin the family name." Roderick's eyes gleamed. "My dear, it's magnificent. Straight out of Webster. I could write a play about it, call it The Killer of Killers. 3 acts, lots of crypts, a spot of incest, perhaps." "Roderick," Daphne clapped her hands to her ears, half laughing, "you are quite heartless." At that moment the door opened and Colonel Lucius strode in, bristling with mustache and ill temper. "So you've come, sir. Thought you might find some amusement in this filthy business, I suppose. Roderick rose languidly. My dear uncle, I came the moment you telephoned. Family solidarity and all that. Besides, I was at a loose end. My new play closed after one matinee in Leatherhead. The critics were savage. The colonel snorted. Serve you right for writing about people murdering their grandmothers. Now listen to me, boy. There's been a murder and the police are sniffing round here like terriers. I want you to keep your mouth shut and your wits about you. No clever talk. No helping the police with their inquiries, understand? Roderick's smile was seraphic. As if I would dream of it. The colonel glared, seemed about to explode, and then thought better of it. He turned on his heel and left, slamming the door so hard that a Waterford decanter rattled on the sideboard. Daphne sighed. He's been like that since it happened. Didn't sleep a wink. And yesterday afternoon he suddenly announced he had to go to London, some nonsense about his tailor, and rushed off on the 4:15. Came back this morning looking like death. Roderick's eyebrows rose. Uncle Lucius traveling up to town on the spur of the moment? That is news. He hasn't left the county since 1947. Miss Marple heard most of this later, pieced together from Cherry, who had a cousin who helped at the hall, and from her own gentle inquiry in the High Street. What she heard interested her extremely. She was sitting in her little front garden pruning the late roses when Roderick's Bentley purred to a stop outside her gate. He uncoiled himself from the driving seat and came up the path carrying a large bunch of hothouse grapes as though offering tribute to a minor deity. Dear Miss Marple, he said, bending over her hand with theatrical grace, the village oracle. I felt I simply had to pay my respects. Miss Marple laid down her secateurs and regarded him with mild amusement. How very kind, Roderick, though I suspect you want something more than the pleasure of my company. He laughed, a pleasant, lazy sound. You wound me, though as a matter of fact I'm rather short at the moment. Uncle Lucius has turned crusty. Could you possibly see your way to advancing me a small loan? Say £50. I should be eternally grateful. Miss Marple shook her head gently. My dear boy, I never lend money. It spoils the character. But do sit down and tell me why you really came dashing down from London. Roderick dropped into the basket chair opposite her and stretched out his legs. Curiosity, pure and simple, and perhaps a little family feeling. After all, when someone leaves a corpse in one's ancestral crypt with one's name pinned to it, one likes to know why. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. And have you any theories? Thousands, darling lady, but none that would bear repeating in a vicarage. Though I must say the whole thing has a distinctly theatrical flavor, that carnation, for instance. Uncle Lucius always wore a carnation in mess dress, blood red like a wound. Someone is being symbolic. Miss Marple's needles clicked. Or someone wishes us to think so. Roderick looked at her sharply, then laughed again. Touché. You always were the cleverest person in this village. Tell me, do the police seriously think one of us did it? They are keeping open minds, said Miss Marple primly, as all good policemen should. Roderick rose, towering over her. Then I shall leave them to it. Thank you for the audience, dear Miss Marple. And if you should change your mind about that small loan. He kissed her hand again and sauntered back to the Bentley. As he drove away, scattering gravel, Miss Marple watched thoughtfully. A charming young man, she murmured to the roses, but slippery as an eel in wet grass. And eels, you know, sometimes wriggle into very dark waters. She returned to her pruning, but her mind was busy with the picture of a carnation, blood red like a wound, and of a young man who had arrived in St. Mary Mead with unusual promptness. Chapter 4, The Stiletto and the Sarcophagus. The weather turned sulky overnight, as English September weather so often does. A thin, persistent rain drifted across the village, turning the lanes to mud and the churchyard to a damp green sponge. Inside the church, the crypt door remained sealed, but the police had not finished with it. At 9:30, Inspector Craddock arrived again, accompanied by a sergeant, a photographer, and a young constable whose chief duty appeared to be holding an enormous umbrella. Miss Marple, who had come ostensibly to finish the Michaelmas daisies, watched from the side aisle with the patience of a cat at a mouse hole. She saw the seals broken, heard the hinges groan again, and noted that Craddock carried a powerful electric lantern that threw long shadows among the pillars. They were down there a considerable time. When Craddock finally emerged, his trench coat flecked with cobwebs and his expression grimmer than before, Miss Marple was arranging purple asters with the most innocent concentration. "Ah, Inspector," she said mildly, "I do hope the damp has not been too trying. Crypts are so bad for the chest." Craddock gave her a wry smile. "We found the weapon, Miss Marple, or rather, we found where it had been hidden." He led her, not without a trace of reluctance, to the far end of the crypt where a massive stone sarcophagus stood against the wall. The lid carved with the effigy of a knight in chainmail, his legs crossed in the manner of a crusader, had been pushed aside by several inches. Fresh scratches marred the floor. "Inside," Craddock said, shining his torch. "Wrapped in oilskin to keep the rust off. Your friend Mr. Pye will recognize it, I fancy." Miss Marple peered politely. The stiletto lay on the stone breast of the long-dead knight, slender as a needle, its hilt a delicate basket of blackened silver. Even in the torchlight it looked wicked. "Beautiful workmanship," she murmured. "Florentine, I should say. 17th century. Poor Sir Gervais de Meade must have been surprised to receive such a visitor after 700 years. Craddock grunted. "The oilskin is new. Bought at Hardcastle's in Much Benham 3 weeks ago. And the sarcophagus lid weighs the better part of 15 stone. Whoever moved it was either very strong or very determined." "Or both," said Miss Marple. News of the discovery traveled faster than the rain. By luncheon, every house in St. Mary Mead knew that the murder weapon had been found resting on a Templar knight like a dark parody of a sword upon a tomb. At the hall, Daphne Killer Whitnash received the tidings with a faint scream and retired to her bedroom with eau de cologne and a novel. Colonel Killer received them with a bellow of rage and telephoned his solicitor for the 3rd time in 2 days. Miss Marple, having finished the flowers, decided that a little calf's foot jelly might be acceptable at the hall. Daphne was always partial to jelly, and one never knew what scraps of information might float to the surface in a darkened bedroom. She found Daphne reclining against lace pillows, a pink satin bed jacket slipping becomingly from one shoulder, her eyes wide with delicious terror. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it ghastly? First a body, and now the dagger hidden with that old knight Lucius is always on about. He's been simply obsessed with the creature for months. Says there's a ruby the size of a pigeon's egg hidden somewhere in the church, part of the Templar treasure. Of course it's all nonsense, but he will have it that the murder is connected with the stone." Miss Marple spooned jelly into a dish with calm precision. "A ruby, you say? How very romantic, though I always understood the Templars were more interested in banking than in jewelry." Daphne lowered her voice to a thrilled whisper. "Lucius swears the knight in the crypt brought it back from the Holy Land and hid it before he died. He's been tapping walls and prying up flagstones like a man possessed. That's why he had the crypt opened in the first place. He thought the survey would give him an excuse to search properly." Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully on the trembling jelly. "And did he find his ruby?" "Not a sign. Only cobwebs and that dreadful dagger. The police think the murderer put it there to throw suspicion on Lucius." Or, said Miss Marple gently, to throw suspicion away from himself. Daphne stared. You mean someone wants us to think Lucius did it? My dear, someone wants us to think a great many things. Murderers usually do. When Miss Marple left the hall an hour later, the rain had ceased and a watery sun glinted on the wet leaves. She walked slowly. Her umbrella rolled tight, turning over in her mind the picture of a stone knight with a modern dagger on his breast, and a legendary ruby that might or might not exist. At the bottom of the lane, she encountered old Mr. Pye, hurrying along under a large golf umbrella, his face the color of old parchment. Good afternoon, Mr. Pye, she said pleasantly. Such a trying time for those of us who deal in antiques. I expect the police will be visiting you about that pretty stiletto. Mr. Pye jumped as though stung. Stiletto? My dear Miss Marple, I sold it weeks ago perfectly legitimately to a gentleman for theatrical purposes. Nothing whatever to do with me. How fortunate, said Miss Marple, though I dare say the police will still wish to know the gentleman's name. Mr. Pye made a small choking sound and hurried on, splashing through the puddles like a frightened water rat. Miss Marple watched him go, then continued her walk, pausing at the churchyard gate to study the ancient yew that overhung the path to the crypt. Its trunk was hollow in places, its roots sprawling like the fingers of some great buried creature. Somewhere beneath it, she reflected, lay the bones of crusaders and plague victims, and quite possibly the answer to several questions. Inside the church, the air was cold and smelled of damp stone and extinguished candles. The flowers she had arranged that morning glowed softly in the dim light. Miss Marple stood for a long time looking at the sealed crypt door, then moved quietly along the side aisle to the sarcophagus of the knight. The lid had been replaced, but a thin line of dust showed where it had been shifted. She laid a gloved hand upon the stone and felt very faintly the lingering warmth of the police lamps. Then she noticed something else. A single thread of crimson silk caught on the rough edge of the lid. It was no longer than her little finger, but bright as fresh blood. Miss Marple detached it carefully with her handkerchief and tucked it into her handbag. Dear me, she said to the silent church, how very careless of somebody. Outside, the sun strengthened a little, and a blackbird began to sing from the yew tree as though the world were perfectly ordinary after all. Miss Marple closed the church door behind her and walked home to tea, her mind busy with knights and rubies and a thread of crimson silk that had no business to be in a crypt. Chapter 5. The Organist's Secret. The rain returned on Wednesday, soft and steady, the sort that soaks through coats and tempers alike. Miss Marple, who believed that fresh air was beneficial whatever the weather, took her umbrella and walked to the church shortly after luncheon. She told Cherry she wished to practice the hymns for Sunday. In truth, she wished to be alone with the crypt and its echoes. The church was empty, cold, and rather gloomy. Water dripped from a cracked gutter somewhere overhead with the regularity of a metronome. Miss Marple lit the lamp above the organ and sat for a few minutes, running her fingers silently over the keys, listening to the building settle around her. Then she rose, took a small electric torch from her handbag, and went quietly down the spiral stair. The police seals had been replaced after the sarcophagus was examined, but the door was not locked. Inspector Craddock trusted village honesty more than most. Miss Marple slipped inside, closed the door behind her, and stood in the darkness until her eyes adjusted. The crypt smelled of wet stone and mortality. She moved the beam of her torch slowly across the floor, noting the chalk marks the police had left, the faint scuffed trail where the body had been dragged. The sarcophagus now decently closed. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed since yesterday. Yet she had not come for nothing. She had come for the feeling that something here was not finished. She was about to leave when a sound reached her from above, a muffled sob, quickly stifled. Miss Marple extinguished her torch, climbed the stairs as silently as age allowed, and peered round the door. Philippa Kendall sat on the organ bench, her head bowed over the keys, shoulders shaking. She had not heard the faint creak of the crypt door. Grief had made her deaf to everything but itself. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment. Then she stepped forward, closed the door with a soft click, and spoke in the gentlest voice she possessed. "My dear Philippa." The organist started violently, spun round, and stared with swollen eyes. "Miss Marple, I didn't hear you come in." "I was in the crypt," Miss Marple said simply, as though elderly ladies made a habit of visiting tombs after lunch. "The police have finished, but I found I needed to see it again. And you, I think, needed to be alone. Shall I go away?" Philippa made a helpless gesture. "No, please stay. I can't bear my own house today. Everything reminds me—" She broke off, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple sat down beside her on the narrow bench and laid a small gloved hand over the trembling ones. "Reminds you of Lawrence," she finished quietly. Philippa's breath caught. "You know? I know you were engaged to Lawrence Killer, yes. Half the village knew at the time, though people have mercifully short memories for other people's romances. But there is more, isn't there?" Philippa turned to her with sudden desperation. "Much more. Oh, Miss Marple, I have kept it secret for 25 years, and now it has risen up like a ghost to destroy me." She drew a shaking breath. "Lawrence and I were married in Cairo in February 1926. A registrar's office, nothing grand, but legal all the same. We meant to tell everyone when we came home, but then the fever took him, 3 weeks after the wedding. I was ill myself. By the time I was well enough to travel, his things had been packed up and sent back to his aunt in England. The marriage certificate was in his dispatch case. The tent caught fire one night, Bedouin raiders, they said, and everything burned. There was no copy, no record I could find. I came home as Miss Kendall again because no one here had ever known any different, and I was too proud or too ashamed to explain." Miss Marple patted her hand. "My dear, there is no shame in loving. But now this man is found wearing Lawrence's evening clothes, the very suit he was buried in. I recognized the carnation buttonhole. He had it made specially in Savile Row before we sailed. Someone has dug up my husband and brought him here to mock me." Miss Marple was silent a moment. Then she said very gently, "Philippa, bodies do not generally rise from Egyptian graves dressed for dinner. And even if they did, they would hardly arrive looking as though they had stepped out of a bandbox. No, someone wishes you to believe Lawrence has returned. The question is why." Philippa stared at her. "You mean the dead man is not Lawrence?" "I am quite sure he is not. For one thing, Lawrence was barely 30 when he died. The man in the crypt was nearer 50. For another, the clothes may be Lawrence's, but the body inside them has been carefully arranged. Arms crossed, carnation fresh enough to suggest it was placed there no more than a week ago. Someone has gone to a great deal of trouble." Philippa's hands twisted in her lap. "Then who is he? And why label him killer?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is what we must discover. But first, my dear, you must promise me something. You will speak of this marriage to no one, not even the police, until I give you leave. Secrets kept for 25 years can be kept a little longer, and knowledge is power." Philippa managed a watery smile. "You sound exactly like a detective in a novel." "I am a detective," Miss Marple replied with great simplicity. "Only I work with human nature instead of fingerprints. Now dry your eyes and play me something soothing. Bach, perhaps. It is wonderful what Bach can do for the nerves." Philippa turned back to the keys. The first solemn chords of the great G minor fantasia rolled out, filling the church with solemn magnificence. Miss Marple sat beside her, eyes half closed, letting the music wash over her like cool water. When it ended, the church felt quieter than before, as though the stones themselves had been comforted. Philippa closed the lid of the organ. "Thank you," she whispered. "I feel lighter." Miss Marple rose. "Good. And now we shall both go home and have a cup of tea. Grief is very exhausting, and one must keep up one's strength." They walked together down the aisle. At the west door, Philippa paused. "Do you believe in ghosts, Miss Marple?" "I believe in human wickedness," Miss Marple answered, "which is quite frightening enough. But I also believe in justice, and that, my dear, is stronger than any ghost." Outside, the rain had softened to a mist. The churchyard gleamed wetly, and somewhere among the gravestones a robin sang. Philippa drew a long breath, squared her shoulders, and walked out into the gray afternoon with more courage than she had felt for days. Miss Marple watched her go, then turned her own steps towards the high street. She had much to think about. A secret marriage, a suit of clothes that had crossed half the world, and the uncomfortable certainty that someone in St. Mary Mead had known Philippa's story for years, and had chosen this moment to resurrect it. As she passed the antique shop, old Mr. Pye twitched the curtain and peered out anxiously. Miss Marple gave him a gentle nod and went on her way, the picture of a harmless old lady returning home for tea. Only the faintest curve of her lips suggested that the harmless old lady was already several moves ahead in a game the murderer had not yet realized was being played. Chapter 6. The alibi railway inspector Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage on Thursday morning looking, as Griselda Clement later described it, like a man who has spent the night trying to mate a porcupine with a timetable. He carried a thick folder under one arm and an expression of profound discouragement under the brim of his hat. Miss Marple received him in the drawing room, where the fire crackled cozily and a plate of shortbread waited in hopeful ambush. She poured coffee, strong, black, and merciful, while Craddock arranged his papers with the air of a conjurer who has mislaid the rabbit. "I have spent 2 days," he announced, "establishing where everyone was on Tuesday night and Wednesday morning, the only period when the body could have been placed in the crypt. And I am further from an answer than when I began." Miss Marple handed him a cup. "Alibis, Inspector, are like knitting patterns. They look perfectly straightforward until one discovers the wool has been wound in the wrong direction." Craddock gave a short, weary laugh. "Very well, here is the pattern so far." He opened the folder. "Colonel Lucius Killer claims he took the 4:15 from Much Benham to Paddington on Tuesday afternoon to visit his tailor. Ticket, stub found in his pocket when he returned Wednesday morning. Tailor confirms an appointment for 5:30 and says the Colonel never kept it. Colonel says he felt unwell, walked about London instead, and caught a late train home. No one remembers seeing him on the platform or in the train. Possible, but thin." Miss Marple nodded. "Lucius is not a man who enjoys being observed when he chooses not to be." Next, Mrs. Daphne Killer Whitnash attended the Women's Institute sewing circle at the village hall from 7 until 10 on Tuesday evening. 23 ladies prepared to swear she never left the room except to fetch more wool from the cupboard. Returned home at 10:15 in the company of Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Hartnell. Solid as Gibraltar. "Dear Daphne," murmured Miss Marple, "is not the sort to carry corpses in the rain." "Roderick Killer," Craddock continued, "says he was in his Chelsea flat all Tuesday night writing. Landlady heard typing until 2 in the morning, but admits she dozes in her chair. No telephone calls, no visitors, no one actually saw him after 7 o'clock. He could have driven down, done the deed, and driven back. The Bentley does 80 without breathing hard." Miss Marple poured more coffee. "Roderick is theatrical. He would enjoy a midnight drive for dramatic effect." Philippa Kendall played the organ for evensong practice Tuesday evening from 6 until 7:30. Church locked afterwards. She has the only key. Says she went straight home, read a little Marcus Aurelius, and retired early. Neighbors saw her light go out at 10. No one to confirm she stayed in. Philippa, said Miss Marple thoughtfully, is a woman of regular habits. Regular habits can be the most deceptive of all. Finally, Mr. Archibald Pye claims he was invited to value furniture at Sir Howard Redmayne's place near Much Benham all Tuesday afternoon and evening. Sir Howard confirms he arrived at 3, left at 10:30, and was paid 25 guineas for his opinion on a dubious Chippendale cabinet. The Redmayne's butler saw him off the premises, 25 miles each way. He would have had to travel like the wind to reach the crypt and return. Miss Marple selected a piece of shortbread. Old Mr. Pye is 71 and drives a 1934 Morris that coughs like a consumptive. I think we may acquit the Morris. Craddock closed the folder with a snap. Exactly. 5 suspects, 5 alibis, none perfect, none impossible. The body was placed in the crypt sometime between dusk on Tuesday and dawn on Thursday. The church was never locked. Anyone could have slipped in. Yet no footprints in the mud, no tire marks, no dragged heel. It is infuriating. Miss Marple gazed into the fire. May I see the Times again? Craddock pushed the sheet across. She studied it for a long minute, lips moving silently. Tuesday, 4:15, she read. Colonel leaves on the train, 6 gone Philippa, begins organ practice. 7 soon Daphne at the Institute. 10:30. Mr. Pye leaves Much Benham, Roderick supposedly typing in Chelsea. Wednesday morning, Colonel returns looking, according to the station porter, like a man who has seen his own ghost. She laid the paper down. Tell me, Inspector, did anyone check the London train on Tuesday evening? Craddock frowned. The 4:15 was crowded. Commuters, market people. No one remembers the Colonel after he bought his ticket. And the late train back. 11:47 from Paddington, arrives Much Benham 1:12 a.m. Only 3 passengers got off. None resembled the Colonel. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Then perhaps the Colonel never left the county at all? Craddock stared. But the ticket stub. Tickets, said Miss Marple mildly, can be bought by anyone, and stubs can be planted. Suppose the Colonel purchased a return ticket, gave it to an accomplice, and remained behind himself. The accomplice travels to London, posts something perhaps, and returns on a later train. Meanwhile, the Colonel has all Tuesday night to do whatever he wishes in the crypt. Craddock rubbed his chin. Possible. But why? That, said Miss Marple, is the fascinating part. When a man of rigid habit suddenly breaks his routine, one may assume strong motive. Lucius has been obsessed with his Templar Knight and the supposed ruby. Perhaps he found something or feared someone else had. She rose and went to the window, looking out at the dripping garden. Or perhaps, she added softly, the body in the crypt is not the only thing that has been carefully arranged. Craddock gathered his papers. I shall check the trains again, and the Colonel's tailor more closely. Thank you, Miss Marple. You have given me a new thread. Only a small one, she said, but even the strongest rope is made of small threads twisted together. After he had gone, Miss Marple stood a long time at the window. Rain slid down the panes like tears. Somewhere in the village a clock struck 11 slow notes. 5 alibis, she thought, like 5 balls tossed into the air by a juggler. Sooner or later one must fall. She returned to her chair, took up her knitting, and began very calmly to count the stitches that would eventually reveal which ball had been painted wood from the beginning. Chapter 7. The second letter, Friday, brought the first real chill of autumn. A wind from the northeast rattled the windows of St. Mary Mead and sent dead leaves scuttling along the lanes like frightened brown mice. Miss Marple, wrapped in a Shetland shawl the color of heather, was addressing envelopes for the Red Cross jumble sale when the postman's knock sounded sharp upon the door. Cherry brought in the silver tray with its small pile of letters. Bills, circulars, a postcard from her nephew Raymond in America, and one plain white envelope addressed in careful block capitals to Miss J. Marple, the Vicarage, St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple turned it over. No stamp, local postmark. She slid it neatly with the ivory paper knife and drew out a single card identical to the one found on the body. 4 letters this time, printed in the same scarlet ink. K-I-L-L. She regarded it for a long moment, then laid it beside its fellow on the little table by the fire. The 2 cards side by side looked like the work of a macabre child playing hangman. "Cherry," she called, "would you ask Inspector Craddock to step round when he has a moment, and tell him to bring his magnifying glass?" Craddock arrived within the half hour, still buttoning his raincoat. He took one look at the new card and whistled softly. "Posted yesterday afternoon in the village," he said after examining the faint postmark. "Someone wants us to know they are still here and still playing." Miss Marple nodded. The first card announced a death. The second promises another. "I think we may expect a third before long." Craddock's face was grim. "I don't like threats, especially when I haven't the faintest idea who is making them." At that moment, the telephone rang in the hall. Cherry answered, listened, and came back looking flustered. "It's the hall, miss. Mrs. Killer Whitnash is in a rare state. Says the colonel has come home." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Come home? He never left, as far as I know." "That," said Miss Marple, already reaching for her hat, "is precisely why we should go at once." They drove to Gossington Hall through a landscape suddenly turned wintry. The great beeches along the drive had begun to shed their leaves in earnest. The hall itself looked bleak and rather forbidding under the low sky. Daphne met them in the hall, wrapped in something expensive and trailing. Her prettiness was blurred by tears and lack of sleep. "Oh, Inspector, thank heaven you've come. Lucius has just walked in as though nothing had happened, and he looks dreadful, quite dreadful." Colonel Lucius was in the library, standing before the fire with a large whiskey in his hand. He had lost weight in 4 days. His eyes were red-rimmed and his mustache uncharacteristically drooping. Craddock wasted no time on pleasantries. "Colonel Killer, you told me you spent Tuesday night in London. Your tailor never saw you, no one remembers you on the train, and you were observed returning Wednesday morning looking, in the station porter's words, half dead. Where exactly were you?" The colonel drained the whiskey at a gulp. "I was drugged," he said hoarsely. "In my club. Ordered a drink. Next thing I knew, I was in a taxi outside Basingstoke with the most infernal headache. No memory of anything in between. Got the first train home." Craddock's voice was sharp. "You expect me to believe someone drugged you, carried you 60 miles, and deposited you in a taxi, all without attracting attention?" "I don't expect you to believe anything," the colonel snapped. "I'm telling you what happened." Miss Marple, who had been studying the colonel with quiet interest, spoke for the first time. "May I see your evening clothes, Colonel? The suit you wore on Tuesday?" The colonel stared, then shrugged. "If you must, Daphne will show you." Upstairs in the dressing room, the dinner jacket and trousers hung neatly on a rack. Miss Marple examined them with care, running her fingers along seams and pockets, lifting the carnation buttonhole to the light. "Perfectly pressed," she murmured. "And the carnation, still quite fresh on Wednesday morning, I imagine?" Daphne nodded, puzzled. "Yes, it was. I remember thinking how odd when he looked so ill." Miss Marple turned to Craddock. "Chloral hydrate," she said quietly, "or something similar. A heavy dose would produce exactly the symptoms the colonel describes. and a man in evening dress asleep in the corner of a first-class carriage would attract no attention at all, merely be taken for a gentleman who had dined too well. Craddock looked skeptical. "But why?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is what someone very much wishes us not to discover." They returned downstairs to find the Colonel pouring another whiskey with a shaking hand. "Colonel," Craddock said, "I must ask you again, have you any enemies?" The Colonel gave a short, bitter laugh. "Only half the regiment, my dear fellow, and my nephew, and possibly my wife when the bills come in. Take your pick." Daphne gave a small shriek of protest, but the Colonel waved her away. "No, let's be honest for once. Someone is playing a filthy game with me, and I want it stopped." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "Then perhaps, Colonel, you should tell us about the Templar ruby. The real story, not the romantic legend." The Colonel's face darkened. "There is no ruby. Never was. Made it up to explain—" He stopped abruptly. "To explain the money you brought home after the war," Miss Marple finished gently. "Regimental silver, I believe, sold in Cairo when funds were short. Perfectly understandable in the circumstances, but awkward if certain photographs were to surface." The Colonel went very white. "How the devil—" Miss Marple smiled. "Village gossip travels in the most unexpected ways, Colonel, and photographs can be dangerous things." Craddock looked from one to the other, baffled but alert. "Are you saying someone has been blackmailing you?" "I am saying," Miss Marple replied, "that someone has been playing a very deep game indeed. And the second card tells us the game is not yet finished." Outside, the wind rose to a moan around the eaves. Somewhere a door banged. The Colonel poured a third whiskey, hands trembling so violently that the decanter chattered against the glass. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer. "Come, Inspector," she said. "We have much to do, and very little time. The next letter, I fancy, will have only 3. As they drove away through the rattling leaves, Craddock glanced at her. "You believe him?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that someone went to a great deal of trouble to make it appear the Colonel was absent when he was not. And that is a very interesting variation on the usual alibi." She was silent the rest of the way, watching the bare trees whip past the windows, and in her mind, the 2 scarlet cards lay side by side like the opening moves of a chess problem that had suddenly become deadly serious. Chapter 8. The ruby that wasn't Saturday dawned bright and cold, the sort of morning that makes church bells sound clearer and village gossip sharper. By 10 o'clock, Inspector Craddock had old Mr. Pye installed in the little room behind the police station at Much Benham, a cup of strong tea untouched before him, and his Adam's apple working like a lift in a panic. Craddock laid the stiletto on the table between them, still in its oilskin wrapping. "Mr. Pye, this was found in the crypt. You sold it 6 weeks ago. I want the purchaser's name, the exact date, and the price. And I want the truth." Mr. Pye's fingers fluttered over the knot of his ancient tie. "Inspector, I assure you it was a perfectly legitimate transaction. A gentleman came in, said he needed it for theatrical properties, paid cash, £35, which was very fair." "Name?" Craddock asked patiently. Pye swallowed. "He gave the name of Smith. Naturally, I thought nothing of it. Half my customers are Smith when they buy something delicate." Craddock leaned forward. "Describe him." "Tallish, dark hair going a little thin, rather a theatrical voice. Wore a crimson tie and smelled faintly of Turkish cigarettes." Craddock sat back. "Roderick Killer. And you never thought to mention this before?" Pye spread trembling hands. "My dear Inspector, young Roderick often buys odd things for his plays. Swords, daggers, a Saracen helmet once. I assumed it was just another prop." At that moment the door opened and Miss Marple entered, unhurried, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. She greeted Mr. Pye with the gentle courtesy she might show the Archbishop of Canterbury. "Good morning, Mr. Pye. I have brought the Italian terracotta Madonna you asked me to look at, but perhaps this is not the moment." Pye seized the distraction like a drowning man. "No, no, Miss Marple, most kind. If you would just leave it on the side." Craddock, who had long ago learned to trust Miss Marple's timing, merely waited. Miss Marple unwrapped the parcel. Inside was not a Madonna, but a small velvet pouch. From it she drew a ruby the size of a pigeon's egg, dark blood red, glowing like a coal in the electric light. Mr. Pye made a choking sound. Miss Marple turned the stone in her fingers. "Paste," she said conversationally. "Very good paste, but paste nonetheless. Colonel Killer had it made in Cairo in 1944 to convince certain acquaintances that he had come into a fortune honestly. The real money, of course, came from elsewhere." She laid the ruby beside the stiletto. "There never was a Templar treasure," she continued gently. "Only a frightened man trying to cover an old indiscretion. And someone has known that for years." Pye found his voice. I may have heard rumors. Village talk. Nothing definite." "Quite," said Miss Marple. "But rumors can be dangerous when they reach the wrong ears. Roderick, for instance, has expensive tastes and inexpensive habits. A packet of photographs showing regimental silver-changing hands in a Cairo bazaar would be worth a great deal to him." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Blackmail." "Blackmail," Miss Marple agreed. "And when the colonel refused to pay more, the game became deadly." She turned to Pye. "You sold Roderick the stiletto. Did he also buy the paste ruby from you?" Pye nodded miserably. 2 months ago said it was for a play about Borgia popes. I thought nothing of it." Miss Marple smiled sadly. "Dear Mr. Pye, we none of us think enough, do we?" An hour later, Craddock confronted Roderick Killer in the lounge of the Blue Boar. Roderick was drinking a pink gin and reading The Stage with professional gloom. "Mr. Killer, did you purchase a stiletto from Mr. Pye 6 weeks ago?" Roderick lowered the paper with a flourish. "Darling Inspector, I acquire weapons the way other men acquire ties. Yes, I bought a pretty little dagger. Needed it for the Duchess of Malfi. I am acquainted with that kind of dagger, you know. Authenticity, always authenticity." "And a paste ruby?" Roderick's smile did not waver. "Props, dear man. One must have something for Lucrezia to poison with." Craddock placed the 2 scarlet cards on the table. "And these?" Roderick's eyes flickered, but his voice remained light. "Someone's idea of a joke in the worst possible taste. Uncle Lucius has made himself ridiculous with his Templar nonsense for years. Yet the joke is on the family name," Craddock said quietly. "Your family name," Roderick shrugged. "I am an artist. I rise above such things." Craddock gathered the cards. "We shall see. Good day, Mr. Killer." Outside in the high street, Miss Marple was waiting beneath the inn sign, her shopping basket over her arm like any other old lady. "Well?" she asked. "He denies everything, of course," Craddock said. "But he is rattled, and the stiletto is his." Miss Marple nodded. "Roderick has always believed the world was created for his convenience. When it refuses, he becomes dangerous." They walked slowly towards the churchyard. "There is still the question of the body," Craddock said. "If Roderick killed a man to frighten his uncle, who was the man? We have no missing person, no identification." Miss Marple paused at the lich gate. "That," she said, "is the most interesting question of all. Because I am beginning to suspect there was no murdered man." Craddock stared. "But the corpse, the blood." "Stage blood is remarkably convincing these days," Miss Marple murmured. "And a tailor's dummy, properly dressed and arranged, can deceive even a doctor at first glance. especially if the doctor is not expecting to be deceived. Craddock opened his mouth, closed it again. Miss Marple patted his arm. "Come, Inspector. Let us take another look at the crypt. I have a fancy to examine Sir Gervais de Meade more closely, and this time we shall bring a tape measure." As they walked up the church path, the wind scattered the last leaves from the yew tree, and somewhere in the distance a train whistle sounded thin and lonely across the frosty fields. Miss Marple's eyes were very bright. "The ruby that wasn't," she said softly, "may lead us to the murder that wasn't, and that, I think, will be the end of the game." Chapter 9. The Drawing Room Denouement. The rain that had threatened all day arrived in earnest on Saturday evening, drumming on the windows of Miss Marple's small drawing room like impatient fingers. The fire had been built high, lamps turned low, and the company assembled with the air of people who know something is coming and are not entirely sure they wish to hear it. Colonel Lucius stood with his back to the mantel, whiskey untouched for once. Daphne, pale but composed, sat on the sofa beside Philippa Kendall, whose hands were clasped so tightly the knuckles showed white. Roderick lounged in the wing chair, one leg over the arm, a cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers. Old Mr. Pye had been persuaded to attend in case of questions about antiques, and now hovered near the door as though measuring the distance to safety. Inspector Craddock stood quietly beside the bookcase, notebook closed for once. Miss Marple, small and neat in dove-gray lace, sat in her usual place and regarded them all with gentle benevolence. "Thank you for coming on such a disagreeable evening," she began as though this were an ordinary tea party. "Inspector Craddock has kindly agreed to let me explain what has been happening in our village. It will be simpler and kinder if we have the whole story at once." She folded her hands in her lap. The body in the crypt was Colonel Lucius Killer himself. A collective gasp rose like steam. The colonel made a strangled sound. Daphne pressed a hand to her mouth. Miss Marple continued serenely. "Or rather, it was meant to appear so. On Tuesday afternoon, the colonel purchased a return ticket to London, gave it to an accomplice, a man now far away and unlikely to be found, and remained in St. Mary Mead. That evening he drugged himself with chloral hydrate, enough to produce genuine collapse, and was carried into the crypt by the same accomplice. There he changed clothes with the tailor's, dummy he had hidden in the sarcophagus weeks before, dressed the dummy in his own evening suit complete with carnation, stabbed it through its sawdust heart with the stiletto, and pinned the card killer to the lapel as a particularly bitter family joke. Roderick's cigarette dropped ash on the carpet. "Aunt Jane, this is absurd." Miss Marple raised a hand. "Patience, dear. I am coming to you." She turned to the colonel, who had gone the color of old parchment. "You intended, did you not, Colonel, to disappear abroad with what remained of the Cairo money, leaving Roderick to be suspected of murdering you for the inheritance? The drugging was to explain your absence from London. The dummy was to provide a body. A crude plan, perhaps, but you were desperate." The colonel found his voice. "How the devil? Because, Lucius, dear, you forgot two things. First, that the churchwardens bricked up the medieval drainage tunnel in 1947. You could not leave that way as you intended. Second, that your evening clothes were hanging in your dressing room for all to see the very next day. Only one explanation fitted. The body and the colonel were the same person." She turned to Roderick. "But you, Roderick, had been blackmailing your uncle for months with those unfortunate photographs. When he suddenly stopped paying, you grew suspicious. You followed him? Perhaps you even supplied the accomplice who helped carry the drugged man, and you discovered the dummy waiting in the crypt, a heaven-sent opportunity. You added the scarlet cards, posted the second from the village on Wednesday, and waited for the hue and cry to ruin him." Roderick laughed, a little too loudly. "My dear lady, you have been reading too many of my plays." "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "I have been reading the evidence. The stiletto was yours. The paste ruby was yours. The crimson silk thread caught on the sarcophagus lid matches the lining of the cape you wore to the Chelsea Arts Ball last month. And the station porter at Much Benham remembers a tall young man in a theatrical coat asking about late trains on Tuesday night." Roderick's smile faltered. Philippa Kendall spoke for the first time, her voice trembling. "Then the dead man—" "There was no dead man," Miss Marple said gently. "Only sawdust and kapok and a great deal of stage blood. Dr. Haydock noticed yesterday that the corpse had not bled as a real body would, but he said nothing, waiting to see who would betray themselves. This morning, when the colonel tried to retrieve his dummy before the police examined it again, he found the crypt locked. In desperation, he posted the second card, KILL, hoping to frighten us into reopening it. The postmark gave him away. The letter was posted after the morning collection by someone still in the village. Silence filled the room, broken only by the rain and the soft tick of the clock. The colonel spoke at last, voice hoarse. "I was a fool. I thought if I vanished, the scandal would die with me. Roderick would inherit nothing but suspicion, and the regiment would never know." He looked at his nephew with sudden weariness. "You young devil! You turned my stupidity into attempted murder." Roderick rose, white to the lips. "Attempted murder? There was no body." "In the eyes of the law," Craddock said quietly, "staging a death to cause arrest and ruin is a serious offense, and the blackmail precedes it." Miss Marple looked from one to the other with great sadness. "Two clever men," she said, "each trying to destroy the other and neither seeing that the real crime was the corruption of a name that once meant honor." She turned to Daphne, who was crying softly. "My dear, your husband will not hang. There is no corpse after all, but he will have to face certain consequences. And Roderick will return those photographs and, I hope, find honest work. The regiment, I think, will accept a quiet retirement to Madeira in exchange for silence." The colonel bowed his head. Roderick stood motionless, the ash from his forgotten cigarette falling like gray snow. Miss Marple rose. "And now, Inspector, perhaps a little seed cake while the formalities are completed. Shock is so lowering to the system." Outside, the rain eased to a gentle patter as though the heavens themselves were relieved the truth was out. In the little drawing room, the fire settled into comfortable embers, and St. Mary Mead prepared, with its usual resilience, to absorb another scandal and turn it, by slow degrees, into legend. Chapter 10. Seed Cake and Clemency. 3 weeks later, the first hard frost silvered the lawns of St. Mary Mead, and the village had almost persuaded itself that nothing very dreadful had happened after all. The crypt had been decently closed, the dummy discreetly cremated along with a quantity of old hymn books, and the scarlet cards locked away in Inspector Craddock's drawer as exhibits that would never see a courtroom. Colonel Lucius Killer had departed for Madeira on the morning packet from Southampton, traveling under the name of Mr. Lucas King, and accompanied by a Daphne who had blossomed astonishingly once the fear of scandal was removed. The hall was shut up, the servants pensioned off, and the regimental silver photographs quietly burned in Miss Marple's kitchen range one afternoon while Cherry was at the pictures. Roderick had accepted a post as drama master at a progressive school in Dorset, where the headmaster believed that delinquent boys responded to Shakespeare and cold showers in equal measure. On his last evening in the village, he called at the cottage to return a borrowed book and to say goodbye. Miss Marple received him in the lamplight, a fresh batch of seed cake cooling on the trivet. "I have come to eat humble pie," he announced with something of his old flourish. "Though I confess your seed cake is more tempting." He, sat where he had sat the day he asked for a loan, but the languid pose was gone. He looked younger, almost contrite. I was a cad, Aunt Jane. Worse than a cad, a criminal fool. If you ever see Uncle Lucius again, tell him I'm sorry. Tell him the photographs are ashes and the boy he used to take fishing is ashamed. Miss Marple cut him a generous slice. My dear Roderick, your uncle already knows. Men of his generation prefer action to apology. But he wrote me a line from Funchal saying the orchids are magnificent and the past, thank heaven, does not travel well. Roderick managed a wry smile. And you? Can you forgive the theatrical nephew who turned a shabby trick into a melodrama? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. I have knitted through many a melodrama, Roderick. One learns to drop a stitch and pick it up again on the next row. You will do the same. He left soon after, walking down the lane with his suitcase and a lighter heart than he had carried in years. Miss Marple watched from the window until the frost swallowed him, then returned to her chair and her knitting. On a bright November morning, she took tea at the vicarage with Griselda Clement, who was expecting again and radiant with it. Such a pity about the colonel, Griselda said, passing the cucumber sandwiches. All that fuss over nothing but a dummy. Though I must say it was clever of you to see through it so quickly. Miss Marple accepted a sandwich. Not clever, dear. Merely experienced. When one has lived as long as I have in St. Mary Mead, one recognizes the shape of human vanity dressed up as tragedy. Griselda leaned forward confidentially. And Philippa Kendall? People say she has had a proposal from the new curate at Much Benham, 20 years younger but terribly earnest. Miss Marple smiled over her cup. Philippa deserves a little earnestness after all these years, and a curate is unlikely to mind about lost marriage lines in Egypt. Outside, the church bell began to ring for morning service, clear and sweet across the frosted roofs. The Michaelmas daisies were over, but the chrysanthemums glowed bronze and yellow along the borders, and a robin scolded from the yew tree that had watched over so many village dramas. Griselda refilled the cups. Do you ever think, Jane, that we live very quietly here? Miss Marple considered the question, her needles clicking softly. We live among passions, my dear. Greed, fear, pride, love. But they are house-trained passions. They wear carpet slippers and take tea at 4 o'clock. That is what makes them so dangerous. One never hears them coming. She selected a piece of seed cake and broke it neatly in two. Still, they are no match for a properly brewed pot of tea and a calm heart. Another cup, Griselda? The vicar's wife laughed and held out her cup. Sunlight struck through the window and laid a bar of gold across the carpet, and for a moment the little room seemed to hold all, the gentle, enduring warmth of England itself. Later, walking home through the churchyard, Miss Marple paused beneath the ancient yew. The scars where the drainage tunnel had been bricked up were already softening under lichen. She laid a gloved hand against the bark. Another little storm in a teacup, she murmured to the listening stones, and the cup did not even break. She continued on her way, past the war memorial and the neatly tended graves, past the post office where Mrs. Archer was already telling the new version of the story, suitably improved. Past the Blue Boar where the regulars would argue for years about whether there had really been a body or not. At her own gate she stopped to admire the last chrysanthemum, its petals edged with frost like old lace. Life, she reflected, was very like chrysanthemums, bright even when the year grew old and remarkably hardy if one remembered to mulch the roots with kindness. Inside, Cherry had laid the tea tray and drawn the curtains against the early dark. The fire danced, the kettle sang, and Miss Marple sat down in her chair with the contentment of a woman who has seen justice done without shattering any more lives than necessary. Somewhere in Madeira, a repentant colonel watered his orchids. In Dorset, a young man discovered that boys could be moved by blank verse. In Much Benham, a curate practiced his proposal speech to an organist who already knew the answer. And in St. Mary Mead, the church clock struck 4, the kettle boiled, and another small human comedy reached its quiet, satisfactory close. Miss Marple poured herself a second cup, added exactly the right amount of milk, and lifted it in a private toast. "To the living," she said softly, "and to the dead who were never dead at all." Outside, the frost glittered under the rising moon, and the village slept peacefully, dreaming its harmless, murderous, kindly dreams.